And we're live. And
Hey.
And so yeah, Jeff, you want to read through the information for this? Oh, actually, I'll just give a couple of lines from Munch.
Okay.
Before I forget Sam. So much for the reformative powers of the Maryland State Penitentiary. This guy is the dimmest bulb I've ever seen. I'm beginning to think maybe he didn't do it. And then I'll talk about Chris Rock's acting later on.
Okay, so this episode is Requiem for Adena, which is episode 17 of season 4. Originally aired March 29th. Maybe it is 18. I mean, the thing on here says 16.
Right.
But they're going broadcast, which order, and I always forget where they stuck it, so it might be 18. All right, so Pembleton and Bayliss arrive at a scene where an 11-year-old girl is found murdered. Shiner says the girl was stabbed in multiple locations and with a serrated blade. Bayliss's mind appears to be wandering as this scene looks eerily similar to the Adena Watson murder. Back at the precinct, Kellerman receives a call from a guy that has already confessed to killing his wife. Howard insists that she come along as the new guy, Kellerman, might talk the shooter out of his confession. Brody tells Munch she's electric, referring to Howard, and then says, I think she's hot. Munch can't understand this. I think he probably can, but anyway. Shiner informs G, Pembleton, and Bayliss that it looks like rape might have been involved in the murder of the 11-year-old girl. Pembleton asks G to keep the press off his back. He also asks that he work alone, much to the disappointment of Bayliss. Alone, Bayliss goes to visit the Watson house again, almost 4 years after he originally did. Mrs. Watson tells him that she didn't know the girl who got stabbed recently and shows him the door when painful memories are brought back. Mrs. Watson still believes that the recently deceased fruit vendor killed her daughter. Bayliss then goes to talk to one of the fruit vendor's friends, who insists the deceased man is innocent and Bayliss ruined his life. Kellerman tells Howard that Brody has a crush on her, and she seems surprised. Howard later confronts Brody in the hall and gets him to admit his attraction. After Brody says he wasn't about to ask her on a date, Howard thinks that this is just a practical joke on her swirling around the squad room. A woman from Sex Crimes gives Pembleton information that an 11-year-old girl was raped last night and has identified her attacker as Carver Dooley, her mother's boyfriend. Pembleton heads over to the girl's house and speaks to her mother, who says that her daughter used to play with the recently murdered girl and that her boyfriend might have seen them together. Pembleton heads to Dooley's house, where he finds a serrated knife. Pembleton grills Carver Dooley in the box. Dooley won't admit a thing and says he let his friend borrow his knife. Bayliss, who has been working alone, gets a chance to go one-on-one with Dooley in the box. Just as he is about to ask Dooley about Adena Watson, Pembleton comes back. With the two detectives now tag-teaming Dooley, he confesses to having sex with a minor. Bayliss eventually gets worked up and badgers Dooley about Adena Watson. Dooley is clueless. Pembleton confronts Bayliss about interrupting his interrogation in the box and tells him he is a liability to the case. Later, cooler heads prevail, and Pembleton tells Bayliss that Dooley confessed to the killing of the 11-year-old girl. I would say that if we did you just described the story for Homicide, we could use that line, Dooley is clueless. But anyway, there's the recap. So let's see what Mr. Morris has to say about this one. It says, having managed to improve Homicide's ratings over the season, the heads of NBC gave Tom Fontana and the show's writers room to experiment with the format, or in this case, revisit an old story. Or, to be truthful, the old story. The murder of Adena Watson was at the center of Homicide's first season and was central in shaping Tim Bayliss. Time has gone by. The show says 4 years, the calendar says 3, but as we saw in the stakeout, Tim hasn't forgotten it. So when Janelle Parsons, a 12-year-old, is found stabbed and sexually assaulted in an alley, Bayliss, perhaps seeing things that he wants to see, thinks that there may be a connection to Adena's murder. However, there was one critical difference to this case. Pembleton is the primary, and he knows how badly the Watson case was botched by the bosses and the media and, yes, his partner, and he doesn't want those mistakes to be repeated. So he insists to G that the case not be designated a red ball and that he be allowed to work this case solo. This may seem very unlikely for an investigation of this nature to be handled. In fact, the Parsons case is modeled after a similar child killing that occurred the same year in Simon's book. Pushing the parallel further, Harry Edgerton, on whom Pembleton is modeled, worked the case in exactly the same way Frank does here, and it was solved without any links to LaTanya Wallace's murder earlier in the year. However, as is the case in this episode, the passage of time has done little to heal the emotional scars that Bayliss received during the course of his first investigation. Old wounds are reopened for the detective, and the show, much like real life, does not offer the benefit of any answers. It also reopens some of the old problems that Tim and Frank have always had during their partnership, especially when Frank goes ballistic when Tim leaks word of the investigation to the press. On a side note, G cautions Pembleton not to get so pissed that he bursts a blood vessel. But in point of fact, Frank is absolutely right about what Tim is doing. He knows that Bayliss's attitude has nothing to do with Adena Watson anymore, that it has to do with Janelle Parsons. It is all about Tim trying to correct the mistakes of the past, and despite Bayliss's best efforts, he can't. Andre Braugher gives a great performance, as he almost always does. His instincts are sharp as they have been, and he is smooth a detective as he is usually. In this episode, he proves that a one-man red ball can sometimes do far more than a troop of police. But at the center of this episode is Kyle Secor, who continues to demonstrate why he is the guts of Homicide. He wears his heart on his sleeve in this show, much like the carnation on his lapel, and he demonstrates that he is still in 9 kinds of pain over Adena Watson's death, so much that he tells G that he isn't sleeping well if he knows how to let a case go. G offers some comfort, but there isn't a lot that he can give. Tim manages to put Adena's ghost to rest after a fashion, discarding the picture of the murdered child that has adorned his desk for 3 years. But ghosts don't go away because of symbolic gestures, and it will soon become clear this case will never go away. The episode is dark and painful, but there are some amusing aspects to it. For one thing, there is Janelle Parsons' killer, Carver Dooley, portrayed memorably by comedian Chris Rock. Dooley is an incredibly dim bulb, so much so that even when Frank interrogates him, he becomes half convinced that Dooley didn't kill him. The mixture of genuine stupidity plus the horror of the crime makes a very disturbing portrayal. Then there is the other subplot involving Brody's crush on Kay Howard, who he calls hot, an adjective that seriously disturbs Munch when he hears it. Howard eventually hears about the crush, but comes to believe that it is a put-on by her male colleagues, leaving poor Brody crushed. This, however, is true to Howard's overall character. But even with the comic elements, Requiem for Adena remains a wrenching, conflicted, and unnerving episode of Homicide. To revisit old wounds as painful as these is something that few television shows would have the guts to do, but Homicide did regularly. I would have been willing to sit through Thrill of the Kill and Map of the Heart in order to get an episode like this, and as is almost always the case, the show delivers when it does. My score, 9.75. So, that's what he had to say. What to say you, baby?
Oh dear.
It's a great beginning.
Well, Pembleton was good. There's nothing in it that was bad, apart from I thought it was cringe-inducing, the stuff with that little fella and Kay. That was it,
You're so respectful of Brody all the time. You really rag on that guy.
Right.
Like me at the beginning of our Blake 7 reviews about Squirrely.
Yes. Eventually, you don't call him that anymore, so that's a.
So maybe you'll eventually not call Brody that little guy. that camera guy with the bad mustache or whatever.
I mean, like, the one thing that could have changed is right at the end. He flips the switch, Frank, to the room, and then a second later, it fades to black. It should have faded to black as soon as he flipped the switch.
Just a suggestion, but if you're going to leave one picture up, you might want to pick one other than that one. You know, not that it's bad. It's just kind of, not, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can go through this. Now, I can comment on Chris Rock. There's 4 or 5 times he said things that he delivered lines. There were 4 or 5 badly delivered lines, in my opinion. So he got by, but I'm not thinking this guy's going to win an Oscar anytime soon.
Well, I don't think Chris Rock would probably claim that he is a great actor, but I thought he worked great for that particular role because it sort of fit. his talent sort of fit the role as required. So
yeah, I mean, it did in between the bits where there was some of the lines just didn't. It just they didn't ring true. But anyway, that's a subjective thing. Where did I put her? Oh, I think I've mentioned all.
Well, I'm curious if you remember what you're referring to specifically. You can.
Was
tell me,
4 or
'cause
5? It was just the way he said the lines. It just wasn't convincing.
Oh, okay.
There's
So
particular lines where he had to emote. It didn't sound.
You didn't buy him as the killer, or you didn't buy him just as being afraid, or that stupid, or what?
No,
Or
it's just that there were 4 or 5 lines that he delivered with emotion. That just were badly acted. Right, okay, we can go through these slides. That's Beatrice Chestnut, Enneagram person. I was watching a video earlier on. So we've got Shiner there and Frank. Let's see if anything pops up. Yeah, the little fella. Any of these 2 people stick out?
Well, Amy Brabson plays Pembleton's wife.
Right.
I don't remember who Nurit Koppel is.
I don't remember now. Walt McPherson is that guy.
all 3 of those are regulars.
Yes.
So
I don't know who Ralph Tabackin is though.
in order, that's Barnfather, Gaffney, and Shiner.
Oh, Shiner, right. Is this guy rest in peace now, this Ralph Tabackin?
Yeah, you asked me that last time.
Right.
Yeah, he died in like 2002 or something like that.
Right. Right, Julie Martin. Have you got any background on Julie Martin?
Well, it wasn't her first story. I think I commented on what was her first story, but I don't remember it off the top of my head now.
Right. Any comments on Lee Bonner?
No.
Right. I think there's something here. This took my fancy. There's something like a clean place is a safe place, something like that.
Yeah.
I just thought that was. Directors love to shoot things through things.
Yeah.
Right, so I'll probably use this as part of the thumbnail, and maybe I'll do a combo one. I'll probably put like this as part of it, and then I'll do like a combo thumbnail. I thought this mug was interesting. Might be a is that like the Maryland state seal or something?
I don't know.
Right. It was nice to see a ballistics thingy on there. Right. And we never really get a close-up of this. It's just sort of in the background. Right. There we go. Right.
I thought the moment, we've discussed before that there are moments that sort of separate Homicide from other cop shows and other dramas. And I think there was the point where when Bayliss had gone in to talk to him alone, and then Pembleton came back in, and the first thought is, oh, Bayliss is going to mess us up. But then it was like they kind of threw in a twist where he didn't, and they started to like work together again well on the interrogation. And so a lot of shows would have been like, oh, this is where Bayliss, he gets back on track and they knock it out and they get the confession and everybody goes home happy. And of course, Homicide makes you think that's what's going to happen, and then Bayliss screws it up anyway, and then it becomes a lingering thing after that. So,
well, I mean, you say that, Jeff, but I mean, is that true? I mean, were other shows as formulaic as that? I mean, was like NYPD Blue as formulaic as that?
NYPD Blue, no, not always. Sometimes it has its moments of that. Over the course of 11 seasons, they had their formulaic plots. The strength of NYPD Blue is actually, in many ways, the same as the strength of Homicide in terms of the characters, the characterization. But as far as those sort of twists in the story, yeah, I think the typical cop show wouldn't have done that. They would have done one way or the other. Either they would have had, it screwed up from the beginning, or they would have had it a redeeming moment. As it is, Homicide's content to kind of jerk you all over the place.
Okay, so which are these crappy shows that you've seen?
Well, I'm not going to start listing bad cop shows. I mean, there's 100 of them at least.
Well, the ones that you've seen, like 3 or 4.
Why?
Well, because all the while throughout these hangouts you've been saying Homicide doesn't do what the normal ones do. I'm just wondering, what are these normal ones?
It pains me to try to think of them. I mean, there's so many of them. In all of the CSI shows, for instance.
Right.
Any of those that I've ever seen, 5 minutes in, you're like, I know where this is going.
Right.
Because it's so formulaic. I don't understand how they can have lasted so long and been that popular, except, well, actually, I do understand. People like formulaic stuff because they can understand it, and then, it all goes back to that Jim Carrey monologue on Saturday Night Live where they did the bit where he's doing a different character than the ones people know from TV and movies, and this guy in the audience is like not laughing because he doesn't understand. So Jim Carrey just starts doing like characters that are well known that he does, and then the guy's like, "Oh yeah, that's funny because I know that." So it's kind of like that, a lot of people, they want the thing, they want, Dragnet is an example. I like Dragnet because it has dramatic stuff in it, but every show follows the same formula over and over again.
Wasn't Dragnet a spoof?
No.
I was thinking of, no, is that
no?
They did a lot of things. Police Squad was
have spoofed it. Yeah, Police Squad's a spoof.
That was a spoof of Dragnet, wasn't it?
It's a spoof of several things, but yeah, Dragnet's one of them. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, Dragnet was an example of a show that just every single time it's the same. They always get the killer. They or whatever the guy. They always follow the same routines, and a lot of that, it's not unrealistic in a lot of ways, because a lot of cop work is repetitive stuff where things happen the same way every time. So that aspect of it isn't unrealistic, but yeah,
I'm surprised that other shows haven't done that before. Right, we always get the villain.
You're surprised that other shows haven't done that before?
No, haven't done what Homicide did, where it was they don't always get the villain.
Oh.
I'm surprised that other shows.
I mean, there's a few others that don't over the years. I mean, on Law and Order, for instance, they always have somebody they arrest, but they don't always get convicted. So actually, on that show, the disappointment as far as the main characters is usually in the trial part of it, as opposed to the cops. But sometimes, yeah, it is formulaic too. However, you don't know whether they're going to win the case or not, because it's not like they win every case. Right.
But was there any like cop series before Homicide where you?
I don't know. I can't say off the top of my head because there's only my knowledge of cop shows before that is limited because I was a kid and I didn't watch a lot. I watched Chips when I was a kid, and it would fit into the formulaic ones.
Right.
No, it was fun. I liked watching it, but but there wasn't particularly anything that innovative other than the fact that it followed motorcycle cops. That was the main thing with Chips. But Hill Street Blues, I think, got a lot of critical review. I have not actually seen much of Hill Street Blues, but apparently there was a lot of people who thought that was pretty realistic when it came to cops. So I imagine that they probably have some cases on that one. They didn't get the guy.
Apparently, when that was on, that was very highly regarded. Hill Street Blues.
Yeah, and of course, one of the Homicide creators and producers worked on Hill Street Blues, Tom Fontana, and the other, of course, Hill Street Blues, Stephen Bochco was the guy who created NYPD Blues, so there's some ties there. But anyway.
Yeah. The reason I asked is that I just wanted to find an example of what you were comparing it to.
I mean, there aren't. I mean, you put me on the spot with that, and they aren't coming to mind. But I mean, I could go back and look at some listings of TV shows and come up with some for you. I mean, Miami Vice, where it was all about the two guys looking good than it was about portraying any kind of real cop stuff. They have a bunch of unrealistic. There's Mission Impossible, shows like that where you have all these shootouts where nobody can hit anything with their guns, and They portray it as if every day of a cop's life is they get into these amazing adventures and foil these long-term villains all the time and stuff like that. Yeah.
Right. Was there ever a radio series where they wouldn't always nail the killer?
Maybe.
Maybe there was something on in the 1930s that was like really radical and really good that most people have not really heard of, but you've heard of.
Yeah. I mean, nothing springs to mind. I mean, there were shows that aren't specifically cop shows that may have had villains that got away in various times. The Superman radio show had that happen plenty of times because you had recurring villains that they didn't always catch. They always in some way or another foiled their plan, but they didn't always necessarily do it completely or whatever. But Johnny Dollar, I think he was not actually a cop exactly. He was an insurance investigator guy, but it was similar to a cop in that he basically it was always the same kind of interactions as a police detective. And I think most of the time they had him solve it, but not always. There were a few instances I think where they didn't. But anyway. But back to this episode.
I'll give it about a 7. What do you give it?
I would say an 8. I like the callbacks to the Adena Watson thing. They, even having actual flashbacks from the episode. Yeah. I liked the juxtaposition of, showing Bayliss arriving at Mrs. Watson's house in the original time, and then does it again. And so I liked a lot of the emotional aspects. Big surprise coming from me that the emotional impact stuff. I like, and I liked the subplot with Munch and Howard and Brody and all that. Like, to me, everything kind of fit well together. There's not like a big flaw in it to me. I in a way was sort of rooting for Bayliss to kind of in that scene where he's with Frank to do the investigation, the interrogation right. Even if they didn't get the confession, just that he wouldn't have gone off on the Adena Watson thing. Because I think that part was a little bit too telegraphed by Frank. He's like, I don't want you to do this because here's what you're going to do, and then he does it. So it was disappointing. It wasn't disappointing as a narrative thing. It was just disappointing to me emotionally as I'm watching it for that to occur. And I think that it felt like that, as sort of Mr. Morris alluded to, that Frank and Tim have sort of gotten to a point in their relationship where you would hope they were past some of these things that they still get into. And so, there's sort of a thing there where maybe they've regressed or something. But other than that, I don't find like a bunch of big flaws in the episode or anything. So I would say about an 8.
Yeah, fair enough. There's no... To me, it's like they've sort of gone to the Adena Watson stuff a lot. Maybe
Yeah,
because
it definitely hung over him quite a bit. I mean, Bayliss personally, but the show in general, because it sort of was what kicked off the show and kind of wonder about the sort of the dark side of the detectives' work, that they're not just all happy smiles all the time.
yeah,
In terms of, well, we solve our cases and everything's great.
and that episode was really good, and the acting especially was very good from the guy in the box that they couldn't quite pin down, and the way he went back at Pembleton. So,
Oh, yeah.
and so I'm just tired of Bayliss whinging about it.
Well, that Frank was too. So Morgan said at that point he was tired of Bayliss in general.
Progressively less scrubbish, and then way, way more scrubbish.
Bayliss is probably the character that does develop or undevelop the most, some of both, maybe. Some progression and regression. Yeah, so he probably changes the most over the course of the series.
So what was Morgan saying there? Who's the scrub and who gets scrubbier?
Bayliss.
Ah.
So that's why I was saying that he's probably changes the most of any of the characters over the course of the series, but because he starts off as sort of the naive, fresh kid detective who wants to just follow the book and solve the cases and do justice, and then
Get out of my face.
yeah, he gets his sort of idealism kind of squashed over the really pretty much from the start, and then repeatedly for years. Is there anything else you want to say about that one?
Not really, except to tell the audience go watch the episode, the original, with the guy in, with the Arabu in. They couldn't.
Oh, the 3 Men and Adena? Yeah, that's one of the best episodes, for sure. All right, well, you can join us next time for our next Homicide review, which is an interesting episode called The Damage Done.
Oh, it's bye from me, folks.
Bye-bye.